The screaming stopped 3 hours ago, but the silence is worse. The year is 867 of the Common Era, the 9th day after the great heathen army captured the city of York, and the woman crouched in the corner of what was once a church has been listening to that silence for long enough to understand what it means. Her name is Elifu of Northumbria. She is 29 years old. She was until 9 days ago the wife of a thing whose lands stretched from the river to the edge of the great forest, a noble woman whose household included 30 servants, whose marriage portion included gold and silver worth more than most villages produced in a decade, whose children were being educated by monks who came specifically to her hall to teach them Latin and scripture. Her children are dead, her husband is dead, her servants are dead, or scattered or taken. Everything she built across 12 years of marriage exists now only in her memory, and even that is fragmenting under the weight of what she has witnessed over the past 9 days. She can smell the smoke that still rises from the burned quarters of the city, can smell the blood that has soaked into the stone floor of this church where the Northmen have gathered their captives, can smell the unwashed bodies of the 43 women who share this space with her. Noble women, merchants' wives, the daughters of craftsmen, anyone the raiders considered valuable enough to keep alive. She can feel the iron collar around her neck, connected by a chain to the collar of the woman beside her, connected in turn to the woman beside her, all of them linked in a line that prevents any individual movement without dragging everyone else along. She can hear the sounds from outside, the guttural language of the Northmen as they divide their plunder, occasional scream that suggests the processing of captives is not yet complete, the rhythmic chanting that she has learned accompanies certain rituals the raiders perform, and she can see through the broken doorway of the church. The berserkers, they are not like the other Northmen. The ordinary raiders are brutal enough. She has seen what they do, has witnessed things that will never leave her mind. But they operate with a kind of rational cruelty, taking what they want with efficient violence that serves comprehensible purposes. The berserkers are different. They wear the skins of wolves and bears. They bite their shields and howl before battle. They seem to feel no pain when wounded, and what they do to captives after the fighting ends follows no logic that Aeljafu can understand. One of them is walking toward the church now. His name, she will later learn, is Sigurd the Red, called that for reasons that have nothing to do with his hair. He has killed 14 men in the taking of York. He has been promised first selection from the noble captives as reward for his service in the assault on the city walls. He is walking toward the church, where Ulfgu is chained and the other captives are pressing back against the walls, and the silence that replaced the screaming 3 hours ago is about to end. What happens next? What happened to Ulfgu and to thousands of women like her across 2 centuries of Viking raids on the British Isles is what tonight's video will reveal. This is not the romanticized Vikings of television dramas. This is not the noble warriors of Scandinavian mythology. This is what the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, the Irish annals, and the Scandinavian sagas themselves document about what happened to captive women after the raids. Practices so extreme that many chroniclers who were not squeamish about violence described them in terms suggesting they exceeded anything else. In their experience, this is what the berserkers did, this is what the sources record, this is what you were never taught. What you are about to learn has been systematically romanticized and sanitized in modern depictions of Viking culture. You know about the Vikings as explorers and traders, as the founders of settlements, from Greenland to Constantinople, as the ancestors of the Norman conquerors who reshaped medieval Europe. You've seen them depicted in popular culture as complex figures, violent certainly, but also brave, honorable in their own way, operating according to a warrior code that commanded respect even from their enemies. But you have never learned what actually happened after the raids. You have never heard about the processing of captives that followed military victory, the systematic evaluation and preparation of enslaved women for transport to Scandinavian markets, the specific practices that berserkers and other elite warriors were permitted as rewards for their service. You have never encountered the sources, both Christian and Scandinavian, that described these practices in terms that make clear they were not random violence but structured behavior, following established patterns. Tonight, you will discover what the medieval sources reveal about the fate of captured noble women after Viking raids. On Anglo-Saxon England, you will learn about the THRL system that processed captives into merchandise, the specific roles that berserkers played in the selection and treatment of high-value captives, the practices documented in sources ranging from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle to the Icelandic sagas. You will learn about Alf Jeffew of North Umbria, who was 29 years old when York fell to the great heathen army and who spent the next 11 months in captivity before her fate was finally determined. About Ede of Mercia, who was the daughter of an ealdorman and who was specifically selected by a berserker chieftain as personal property. About Quentrith of East Anglia, who attempted to escape during the processing and discovered what the Northmen did to captives who resisted. About Hild of Lindisfarne, who was captured during the famous raid of 793 and whose story is preserved in monastic records that describe her fate in terms that later Copius tried to suppress. You will learn these things from the sources themselves, from chronicles written by monks who witnessed the raids, from sagas that describe Viking practices from the Scandinavian perspective, from archaeological evidence that confirms what the written sources describe. Vikings documented what they did because they did not consider it shameful. They wrote about captive taking and THRM as normal aspects of raiding that their descendants should know about and emulate. Subscribe if you want to understand what the Viking Age actually looked like for the people who experienced it as victims rather than as adventurers. Comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from, because Ulfgu is crouched in that church. In York and Sigurd, the red is walking toward the door, and I am going to tell you exactly what happened next, what the sources document, what the captives experienced. and what the evidence reveals about practices that shape the lives of tens of thousands of women across 2 centuries of raiding. But first, I need to explain what berserkers actually were and why their treatment of captives was different from that of ordinary raiders. The berserkers occupy a unique position in Viking military culture, elite warriors whose battlefield behavior was so extreme that even other Vikings regarded them with a mixture of awe and fear. The word itself comes from the Old Norse, meaning either bear shirt or bear shirt, depending on interpretation, and both meanings capture something true about these warriors. They went into battle in altered states of consciousness that the sagas describe as berserker gang, the berserker fury. In this state, according to sources ranging from Snorri Sturluson's prose eta to the Yngling Saga, they howled like wolves bit. Their shields felt no pain from wounds and fought with a strength and ferocity that seemed superhuman to observers. They could not distinguish between friend and enemy. They attacked anything that moved. After the fury passed, they often collapsed into exhaustion so complete that they could not move for hours or even days. Modern researchers have proposed various explanations for the berserker gang. Some suggest consumption of psychoactive mushrooms, particularly Amanita muscaria, which can produce the dissociative states and pain insensitivity the sources describe. Some suggest extreme psychological conditioning, training from childhood to enter trance states on command. Some suggest genetic or neurological differences that made certain individuals prone to dissociative rage states. The sources themselves attribute the berserker gang to possession by animal spirits or favor from Odin, the god of war and death. Whatever the explanation, the behavioral pattern is consistent across sources. Berserkers fought with exceptional violence. They inspired terror in enemies who believed they faced something more than human. And after battles ended, they did not simply return to normal behavior. Sources describe a transition period during which the fury gradually subsided, a period during which berserkers were given access to captives and plunder as both reward and outlet for the aggression that continued after combat ended. This is the context for understanding what berserkers did to captive women. They were not ordinary raiders whose treatment of captives followed ordinary patterns. They were elite warriors in altered psychological states, granted special privileges by their commanders, operating under different rules than other members of raiding forces. What they did to captives was considered their due payment for services that made Viking military operations successful. The Great Heathen Army that captured York in 867 included a significant berserker contingent. The army was larger and better organized than typical raiding forces commanded by the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, equipped for prolonged campaigning rather than quick strikes. The berserkers served as shock troops, the warriors who led assaults on fortified positions, who broke through defensive lines, who created the chaos that allowed ordinary raiders to complete their work. Saja the Red was one of these berserkers. The sources do not record his full biography, but they record enough to establish his status and his reputation. He had served in raids across the North Sea for approximately 12 years. He had survived wounds that should have killed ordinary men. He was known for practices after battles that made even other Vikings uncomfortable, and he had been promised first selection from the noble captives taken at York as reward for his role in breaching the city walls. He was walking toward the church where Ulfgu was chained, and what was about to happen would follow patterns that the sources document across dozens of similar incidents. Processing of captives after a Viking raid followed established protocols that the sources describe with sufficient consistency to reconstruct the standard sequence. The first stage was sorting. Captives were divided into categories based on their apparent value, nobility, and wealth indicated by clothing, jewelry, and bearing, physical condition, indicating capacity for labor or other service, age indicating likely survival during transport, and remaining years of useful life. This sorting happened quickly, usually within hours of a settlement's capture, while the memories of who had been captured, where, and in what condition was still fresh. Elf Jeffu was identified as a noble woman. Immediately, her clothing, fine wool, dyed with expensive colors, marked her status. Her jewelry, gold rings, silver brooches confirmed it. Her bearing, the posture of someone accustomed to giving commands rather than receiving them, made her category unmistakable. She was separated from common captives and placed with other noble women in the church that the Northmen had converted into a holding facility. The second stage was claiming elite warriors who had distinguished themselves in the fighting were given first access to high-value captives. This was not chaotic looting, but structured distribution. Commanders allocated captives based on assessed value, and warriors demonstrated merit. The most valuable captives went to the most important warriors. Berserkers, because of their exceptional combat role, were typically among the first to claim. Sigurd the Red had earned his claim through his role in the assault. He had been the first over the walls, had killed the defenders who tried to stop him, had held an opening through which other warriors poured. His claim was acknowledged by the army's commanders. The sons of Ragnar themselves had nodded when he stated which captive he wanted. He wanted the noble woman with the gold rings. He wanted Ulfgu. The third stage was marking. Claimed captives were marked to indicate ownership, typically through collars, brands, or other physical indicators that would prevent disputes about who had claimed whom. The collar around Ulfgu's neck was already in place, generic marking indicating she was captive property of the army. What Sigurd did when he entered the church was replace that generic collar with one bearing his personal mark, a runic symbol that identified her as his specific property. The marking happened in front of the other captives. This was deliberate. The sources indicate that public marking served psychological purposes beyond simple identification. It demonstrated to all captives that they were property now, that their status had fundamentally changed, that the collars and chains were not temporary restraints but permanent indicators of their new condition. Alfie did not resist when Sigurd removed the generic collar and replaced it with his own. She had seen what happened to captives who resisted. She had witnessed during the 9 days since York's fall exactly what the Northmen did to women who fought back. She stood still while the cold iron closed around her neck, while the runic mark of her new owners pressed against her throat, while the other captives watched and understood that what was happening to her would soon happen to them. The fourth stay was removal. Claimed captives were taken from the common holding area to wherever their new owner chose to keep them. For ordinary warriors, this might mean a tent in the army's camp. For elite warriors like Sigurd, it meant quarters appropriate to their status. In this case, a stone building that had been a merchant's house before the assault, now serving as residence for one of the army's most valued berserkers. Sigurd did not speak to Elf Jeffu as he led her through the streets of conquered York. He did not explain what was going to happen. He did not acknowledge her as a person capable of understanding or responding. He simply walked, holding the chain attached to her collar, and she followed because the alternative was being dragged. The building he brought her to smelled of blood and smoke and something else, the particular animal musk that she would learn to associate with berserkers, the scent of wolf and bear pelts that they wore as marks of their status. The interior was dark lit only by a fire pit in the center of the single large room. The walls were hung with weapons and trophies from previous raids, and in the corner, chained to an iron ring set into the stone wall, were 2 other women who had been claimed before her. The sources that document Viking treatment of captives are multiple and consistent in their general descriptions, though they vary in the level of detail they provide. Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the primary English source for this period, describes the taking of captives in terms that emphasize the scale and the suffering without providing explicit detail entries for years of major raids. Note that women were taken or carried off, that monasteries and settlements were destroyed utterly, that the survivors were subjected to heathen practices that the chroniclers declined to specify. The Irish annals are somewhat more explicit. Irish monasteries were raided repeatedly throughout the Viking Age, and the monks who maintained the annals recorded what they witnessed with a precision that suggests traumatic attention to detail. Entries describe captives being used according to the custom of the pagans, subjected to treatment worse than death, kept in conditions that the annalists compared to livestock awaiting slaughter. The Scandinavian sagas, written from the Viking perspective, provide the most detailed accounts. These sources do not condemn Viking practices, they describe them as normal aspects of successful raiding. The Laxer saga describes the taking of Irish captives in terms that include specific references to what was done to high-value women before they were transporting to Scandinavian markets. The saga of the Jams Vikings describes berserker treatment of captives as a recognized practice, something that elite warriors were expected to engage in, and that their commanders permitted as reward for service. What these sources collectively describe is a period immediately following capture, during which claimed Captives were subjected to treatment, designed to establish the new power. Relationship in the most direct way possible. The sources use terms that medieval readers would have understood, but that modern scholars often translate with euphemisms. The Old Norse word for what was done translates literally as breaking. The captive was broken the way a horse might be broken, forced to accept a new role through methods that combined physical dominance with psychological destruction. The first night after claiming was when this breaking typically began. Elf Jeffu spent her first night in Sigurd's quarters, experiencing what the sources describe the two women who had been claimed before her. One, the merchant's wife. One, the daughter of a craftsman, had already undergone their first nights there. Condition when Orfeo arrived suggested what she could expect. One of them would not meet her eyes, the other had not spoken since her capture, though Orfeo would later learn she had been articulate and witty before York fell. What happened in that room over the following hours is described in sources with varying levels of explicitness. The sagas describe berserker treatment of thralls in terms that include physical domination, the use of restraints, and practices that the sources indicate were particularly associated with warriors who fought in altered states. Christian sources describe the same events in terms of violation and desecration, using vocabulary associated with the destruction of sacred things. Modern scholars who have analyzed these sources identify consistent patterns. The treatment was not random violence. It followed established forms that captives across different times and places describe. Similarly, the treatment was progressive, beginning with experiences designed to establish dominance and escalating based on the captive's responses. The treatment was comprehensive, targeting not just the body but the identity, designed to destroy the captive's sense of self as preparation for her new role as property. By morning, Orfeo had experienced the beginning of what she would experience for the next 11 months. She had learned the first lesson that all claimed captives learned: resistance produced additional suffering without changing outcomes. Compliance produced less suffering but changed nothing about what was going to happen. The only variable she controlled was how much she suffered. While the predetermined events occurred, she chose compliance. The two women chained beside her had already learned the same lesson. 3 of them began their lives as Sigurd's property with the knowledge that their choices extended only to how they experienced what they could not prevent. The medieval sources used the term breaking to describe what happened to captives during the period between capture and final disposition. This term appears in both Christian sources, which condemn the practice, and Scandinavian sources which describe it as normal and expected. The consistency suggests that breaking was the recognized name for a specific process, not merely a metaphor for general mistreatment. The process had identifiable stages that the sources describe with varying levels of detail. The first stage was physical dominance, establishing through direct experience that the captive had absolute power over the captive's body. This stage typically occurred during the first days after claiming and included the practices documented in the sources I have already described. The purpose was not merely to inflict suffering, but to demonstrate that suffering could be inflicted at will, that the captive had no capacity to prevent or resist whatever the captor chose to do. The second stage was identity destruction, attacking the beliefs, relationships, and self-concepts that allowed the captive to maintain a stable sense of who she was. Captives were forbidden to use their former names. They were forbidden to speak of their former lives. They were punished for any behavior that suggested they considered themselves anything other than property. The purpose was to create psychological disorientation that made resistance more difficult and acceptance more likely. The third stage was conditioning, teaching the captive to respond to commands automatically, to anticipate the owner's desires, to behave in ways that demonstrated acceptance of her new status. This conditioning used methods that modern psychologists recognize as effective for creating compliance, rewards for desired behavior, punishment for undesired behavior, unpredictable alternation between kindness and cruelty that kept the captive focused on reading the owner's mood rather than on her own internal state. The fourth stage was testing, placing the captive in situations that would reveal whether the breaking had been successful. Could she be trusted with limited freedom without attempting escape? Could she perform assigned tasks without supervision? Could she interact with others in ways that demonstrated acceptance of her status? Captives who passed these tests moved toward final disposition. Captives who failed were subjected to additional breaking. Jeffa experienced all four stages across the 11 months she spent as Seeger's property. The sources do not provide a detailed chronology of her individual experience, but they provide enough documentation of standard practices to reconstruct the general pattern. The physical dominance stay lasted approximately 2 weeks. During this time, Ulfgu was not permitted to leave Sigur's quarters. She was not permitted to speak except in response to commands. She was subjected to treatment that established beyond any doubt that her body was no longer her own, that what was done to it was determined entirely by Sigurd's will. The identity destruction stage overlapped with the physical dominance stage and continued for approximately 2 months. Elf Jeffu's name was replaced with a Norse term, meaning the Saxon, a category rather than an identity. Her clothing was replaced with rough wool marked with Sigurd's ownership symbol. Her jewelry was taken, her hair was cut. Every visible marker of her former status was removed and replaced with markers of her new status. The conditioning stay continued throughout her captivity. She learned what pleased Sigurd and what angered him. She learned to anticipate his needs before he expressed them. She learned to make herself useful in ways that might lead to better treatment. She learned to suppress every response that might be interpreted as resistance, to perform compliance so convincingly that she sometimes could not tell whether the performance had become genuine. The testing stage came approximately 4 months after her capture. Sigurd began taking her outside his quarters, displaying her in the camp, requiring her to perform tasks that involved limited, unsupervised movement. She did not attempt to escape. She had learned what happened to captives who attempted escape. She had watched one of the other women in Sigurd's quarters try to flee during the second month and had witnessed what was done to her when she was recaptured. By the time the great heathen army moved on from York, Elfgu had been broken in that technical sense. The sources describe she was not the same person she had been before the capture. Something fundamental had been destroyed or suppressed or transformed. What remained was capable of functioning as property, of performing the role that the breaking process was designed to create. Let me tell you now about 4 other women whose experiences during the Viking raids on England were documented well enough to reconstruct their stories. Women whose outcomes were different from Alfie's in ways that reveal the range of what the THRL system produced. Ebba was the daughter of an ealdorman, nobleman of high rank in the Anglo-Saxon system, comparable to a count or earl in continental terminology. She was 19 years old when her father's estate was raided in approximately 871 during the Great Heathen Army's campaign. Through Mercuria, she was captured along with her mother and 2 younger sisters during the assault that killed her father and most of his household. Warriors, the family's high status was immediately apparent to the raiders. Their clothing, their jewelry, their bearing all indicated wealth and rank that would translate to high prices in the THR markets or high value as personal property. The 4 women were separated from common captives and held for distribution among the armies. Leadership, Eid was claimed by Berserker chieftain named Halfdan, one of the commanders of the Great Heathen Army and reputedly a son of Ragnar Lothbrok himself. The claim was contested. Other high-ranking warriors wanted her, but Halfdan's status prevailed. Eid became the property of one of the most powerful men in the invading force. Her mother and sisters were claimed by other warriors. The family was separated within hours of capture and would never be reunited. Eid would later learn that one sister died during transport to Scandinavia, that another sister was sold in the Dublin slave market to a buyer whose identity was not recorded, and that her mother survived approximately 3 years in captivity before dying of causes the sources do not specify. What made Eid's experience different from Ulfgu's was the status of her captor. Halfdan was not merely a successful warrior, he was royalty by Viking standards, a commander of armies, a man who would eventually become king of a portion of the territory his army conquered. His household was larger, more organized, more concerned with maintaining appearances appropriate to his rank. Eid was not kept in rough quarters and subjected to the immediate breaking that ordinary captives experienced. She was placed in a household that included other high-status captives, attended by servants who were themselves THRS treated ways that recognized her value as a status symbol for her owner. She was still property, still subject to Halfdan's will in all things, but the expression of that ownership took different forms than it took for captives owned by ordinary warriors. The sources describe her condition in terms that suggest a kind of gilded captivity. She wore fine clothing, though marked With half-Dan symbols, she ate well, though at his table and at his pleasure. She was permitted to maintain certain dignities, though only those that her owner chose to permit. The physical treatment she experienced was less brutal than what ordinary captives endured, though the sources make clear that she was used according to her owner's desires, regardless of her own. What the sources also make clear is that Ebba adapted to her circumstances more successfully than many captives. She learned Norse quickly, becoming fluent within months. She made herself useful to Halfdan's household in ways that went beyond her value as property, advising on Saxon customs, helping negotiate with English leaders, serving as translator in situations where such service was valuable. She became, in the terminology of the sources, a favored THRL property that had earned preferential treatment through demonstrated usefulness. When Halfdan was killed in battle in approximately 877, Edber's status became uncertain. Property of a dead man could be inherited, sold, or simply taken by whoever had power to claim it. Sources indicate that she was claimed by another member of Halfdan's faction, that she continued in similar conditions to those she had experienced before, and that she eventually died in Scandinavia at approximately 40 years of age, still enslaved but having survived longer than most captives and in conditions less brutal than most endured. Her story is not triumphant. 20 years of slavery, separation from family, death far from home, these are not elements of a happy ending, but she survived, she adapted, she found ways to make her captivity more bearable than it might have been, and her survival itself is a kind of testimony, evidence that some captives found ways through the system that destroyed so many others. Quentreth was the wife of a then in East Anglia, captured during the campaign of 869 that culminated in the death of King Edmund, the Edmund who would later be venerated as a saint and martyr. She was 26 years old, the mother of 2 children, who were killed during the raid that captured her, and she was claimed by warrior whose name the sources record as Thoril the Cruel. The name tells you something about what followed. Quentin's response to capture was different from Alfie's calculated compliance. She fought from the moment of capture. Through the first weeks of her captivity, she resisted every stage of the breaking process with whatever means were available to her. She attacked the warrior who first seized her. She attempted to escape during transport. She refused to follow commands, refused to perform submission behaviors, refused to accept that her status had changed. The sources describe Thor's response in terms that suggest he considered her resistance a challenge rather than an inconvenience. Some warriors would have killed a captive who resisted so persistently. Damaged merchandise was worth less than cooperative merchandise, and some captives simply were not worth the effort of breaking, but Thoril apparently saw Quentin's resistance as something to be overcome, a battle to be won, a demonstration of his dominance that would be more satisfying because she fought so hard against it. What followed was the most extreme version of the breaking process that the sources document. Quentin was subjected to treatment that went beyond the standard Protocols extended physical orals, designed to exhaust her capacity for resistance, isolation that lasted weeks, rather than days, deprivation of food and water until compliance became necessary for survival. The sources describe her condition at various points in terms that suggest progressive deterioration, weight loss, signs of injury, changes in behavior that indicated the breaking was succeeding. Despite her efforts to resist, resistance lasted approximately 6 weeks. The sources describe the end not as sudden surrender, but as gradual collapse, a point at which Quenth's body and mind simply could not sustain further defiance when compliance became automatic because she no longer had resources to resist. What the sources describe in the aftermath is consistent with what modern psychologists call severe traumatic response, a state in which the personality has been so damaged by sustained assault that normal functioning is no longer possible. Quentin did not become a favored THRL. Like Eidber, she did not adapt successfully to her circumstances. The sources indicate that she survived approximately 18 months after the end of her active resistance, but that she was never again capable of the complex behavior that successful adaptation required. She performed basic tasks when commanded. She did not resist further treatment, but she also did not speak unless required to, did not respond to stimuli beyond immediate commands, did not show evidence of internal life beyond what was necessary for bare survival. She died in approximately 871, at approximately 28 years of age. Cause of death is not recorded, but the sources suggest that her body simply gave up, that the damage from the breaking process and its aftermath exceeded what physical systems could sustain. Modern psychologists would recognize her trajectory as consistent with death from prolonged traumatic stress, the body systems failing under loads they were never designed to carry. Quenth's story is the dark mirror of Eidber's. She fought and lost. Her resistance did not save her. It may have made her experience worse than it would have been had she complied, but her resistance was also the only choice that allowed her to remain herself for as long as she did. She died broken, but she died having fought, whether that is better or worse than surviving through compliance is a question that has no clear answer. Hild was a nun at the monastery of Lindisfarne, the holy island off the coast of North Umbria that was the site of the first major Viking raid on England in 793. She was approximately 24 years old at the time of the raid, had taken vows at 18 and had spent 6 years in religious service before the Northmen came. The raid on Lindisfarne shocked the Christian world. Monasteries were supposed to be sanctuaries protected by their sacred status from the violence that secular settlements might experience. The Vikings did not recognize this protection. They treated Lindisfarne as they would have treated any wealthy settlement, killed those who resisted, took what they wanted, carried off whoever they could sell. Hild was among those carried off. Her status as a consecrated religious made her particularly valuable in the eyes of the raiders, not because they respected her vows, but because they understood that violating those vows would be particularly offensive to the Christian God and particularly distressing to those who worshipped him. The desecration of religious women was itself a form of warfare against the Christian culture. The Vikings were raiding the monastic. Sources that record his story do so with evident discomfort. The chroniclers, who preserved the account clearly, struggled with how to describe what happened to her, how to acknowledge the reality without providing details that might seem to celebrate or normalize the violation of someone who had been dedicated to God. The result is a narrative that indicates what happened through euphemism and circumlocution, making clear the general nature of her experience without explicit description. What the sources make clear is that Hild was subjected to treatment specifically designed to violate her religious identity. She was forced to witness the destruction of sacred objects from Lindisfarne. She was required to perform acts that violated her vows in the most direct way possible. She was kept in circumstances that the sources describe as deliberately sacrilegious, treated ways that mocked her faith and her former status. The breaking of a religious woman followed patterns similar to those applied to secular captives, but with additions targeting her specific identity. Theodora of Macedon's story from the Roman script shows similar patterns. The deliberate destruction of religious identity as preparation for the captive's new role as property. The Vikings applied the same logic with their own methods, understanding that religious identity was a form of psychological resistance that had to be destroyed before the captive could be successfully integrated into the THR system. Hild's fate after the initial raid is unclear in the sources. Some accounts suggest she was taken to Scandinavia and sold in the THR markets there. Some accounts suggest she was kept as property by the raiders who had captured her. Some accounts suggest she died during transport, her body unable to survive the combined physical and psychological damage she had sustained. What the sources do record is that Hild's experience became part of the argument for Christian resistance to Viking raids, evidence that the Northmen were agents of evil who would desecrate the most sacred things, who would violate women dedicated to God, who would stop at nothing in their assault on Christian civilization. Her story was preserved not for her sake, but for propaganda purposes. Her suffering transformed into a tool for motivating resistance to future raids, whether she would have wanted her experience used this way is a question the sources do not address. The chroniclers who preserved her story cared about the message her experience could communicate, not about her individual fate or her own perspective on what had happened to her. She became a symbol of Viking brutality, of Christian suffering, of the stakes involved in the conflict between cultures. The woman herself, what she thought, what she felt, what she experienced beyond the symbolic value of her violation remains largely invisible in the sources that have preserved her name. Gajifu was the wife of a minor noble in Wessex, captured during a raid in approximately 876, after the great heathen army had conquered much of eastern and northern England. But while Wessex remained free under King Alfred, she was 33 years old older than most high-value captives, and her selection was apparently based on her documented skills rather than her youth or beauty. Godgu was known in her region as a skilled healer, someone who understood herbs and medicines, who could treat wounds and illnesses with methods that the sources describe as unusually effective. This knowledge made her valuable in ways that transcended her value as a common THRL. The Vikings, like all peoples who engaged in frequent warfare, had constant need for medical skill. A captive who could keep warriors alive and functional was worth more than a captive whose value lay only in domestic service or other purposes. The warrior who claimed Godfu, his name, is recorded as Bjorn, though this was a common name and his specific identity is uncertain, apparently recognized her value quickly. She was not subjected to the standard breaking process. She was not treated as other captives were treated. She was placed immediately into a role as healer for Bjorn's war band, treating wounds sustained in raids, preparing medicines from whatever herbs could be obtained, practicing the skills that made her valuable. This does not mean she was free. She was still property, still subject to Bjorn's will, still legally and practically a THRL who could be sold or disposed of at her owner's discretion. But her circumstances were different from those of captives whose value lay in other areas. She was needed intact and functional. Damage that would reduce her capacity to perform medical work would reduce her value. Her treatment reflected this economic logic. Godgu survived in captivity for approximately 12 years. During this time, the sources suggest she treated hundreds of warriors, earned a reputation for skill that spread beyond her owner's immediate war band, and became someone whose loss would have been genuinely mourned by those who depended on her care. She was not loved. Thralls were not loved in the way free people were loved, but she was valued, and the value translated into treatment that was notably better than most captives experienced. She was eventually freed. The circumstances are not entirely clear. Some sources suggest she was freed in her owner's will. Others suggest she purchased her freedom through accumulated payments for her services. Others suggest she was freed as part of negotiations between Viking leaders and English authorities. What is clear is that at approximately 45 years of age, after 12 years of captivity, Gajafu became a free woman again. She did not return to Wessex. The sources indicate that she remained in the DNE law, the portion of England under Viking control, and continued practicing medicine until her death at approximately 52 years of age. She apparently built a life in the land of her former captives, using skills that had first made her valuable as property to establish herself as a free practitioner of medicine. Godgu's story is the closest thing to a success story that the sources provide. She survived, she was freed, she built life after captivity, but her success was built on exceptional circumstances, skills that most captives did not possess. An owner who recognized the value of keeping her intact, opportunities for freedom that most THRS never received. Her story should not be read as evidence that the thrall system was survivable for most captives. It should be read as evidence that some captives in some circumstances found paths through the system that others could not find. The ultimate destination for most captives was the thrall market, the slave markets that operated throughout the Scandinavian world and in Viking-controlled territories across Europe. These markets were major commercial operations handling thousands of captives per year at the height of the Viking Age, connecting the raiding economies of the north with the labor demands of agricultural and domestic operations throughout Scandinavia. The largest markets operated in major trading centers: Hedib in Denmark, Birka in Sweden, Kalpang in Norway, Dublin in Ireland. These centers attracted buyers from across the Viking world and sometimes beyond. Arabic sources described Scandinavian thralls being sold in markets as far away as Baghdad, transporting along the river routes that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea and beyond. The journey from point of capture to final market could take months. Captives taken in England might be transporting first to Ireland or Scotland, then to Scandinavia, then potentially further east or south, depending on market conditions. Each stage of transport reduced the captive population. Some died from the conditions of travel, some were sold at intermediate markets, some were kept by their captors rather than being sold. By the time Ulfkafu reached a thrall market, approximately 11 months after her capture at York, she had traveled across the North Sea, had spent time in several temporary holding facilities, and had been evaluated multiple times by traders assessing her potential sale value. She had watched other captives die during transport. She had watched others be sold at intermediate markets to buyers whose purposes she could only imagine. She had learned that the breaking she had experienced at Sigurd's hands was only the beginning of a process that would continue as long as she remained property. The markets themselves operated with a commercial efficiency that the sources describe in terms similar to livestock markets. Captives were displayed on platforms where buyers could inspect them. Physical characteristics were demonstrated: height, weight, fitness for different types of labor. Skills were verified when claimed literacy, weaving, medical knowledge, whatever might increase value. Prices were negotiated based on supply, demand, and individual characteristics. The sources indicate that Alf Jeffu was sold at a market in Habe for a price that reflected her noble background, her education, her physical condition, and her demonstrated compliance. The buyer was a wealthy landowner whose name is not recorded, whose estate was located somewhere in what is now southern Sweden, whose purposes for purchasing her are not specified in the sources. What the sources do specify is that Alfie was never seen in England again. She disappeared into the Scandinavian thrall system, became property on an estate far from her homeland, lived out whatever remained of her life in circumstances that the historical record does not illuminate. She had been 29 years old when York fell. She was approximately 30 when she was sold at Hedip. How long she survived after that, what she experienced, whether she ever achieved freedom or died in slavery. These questions cannot be answered from the available evidence. She became one of the thousands of English women who were absorbed into the Viking world during the centuries of raiding and never returned. Her story is preserved only in fragments enough to reconstruct what happened to her during the 11 months between capture and sale, not enough to know how her story ended. The treatment of captive women during the Viking Age is documented in multiple categories of surviving evidence. The Anglo-Saxon sources provide the English perspective. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the major raids and their consequences in terms that make clear the scale of captive taking without providing extensive detail about what happened afterward. Letters and other documents from English churchmen describe the suffering of those taken by the Vikings in terms designed to motivate resistance and support for military response. The Irish sources provide parallel documentation. The Irish annals record Viking raids on Ireland with detail that often exceeds the English sources, including specific references to the treatment of captives and the operation of the Dublin slave market. Irish churchmen produce some of the most vivid descriptions of Viking practices, writing from direct observation of what happened in their own communities. The Scandinavian sources provide the Viking perspective. The Icelandic sagas, composed in the 12th and 13th centuries but drawing on earlier oral traditions, describe raiding and captive taking as normal aspects of Viking culture. These sources do not condemn the practices they describe. They present them as things that successful Vikings did, behaviors that their descendants should know about. Legal texts from medieval Scandinavia document the THRL system in detail, including regulations about the treatment, sale, and manumission of enslaved people. Archaeological evidence confirms what the written sources describe. Excavations at Viking Age sites have uncovered evidence of slave quarters, restraints, and other physical infrastructure of the THR system. Analysis of skeletal remains has identified individuals whose isotopic signatures indicate they grew up in different regions than where they died. Evidence of the longue distancines movement of enslaved populations that the sources describe. The Arabic sources provide an external perspective. Muslim travelers and traders who encountered the Vikings along the eastern trade routes described what they observed, including detailed accounts of thrall markets and the treatment of captives. These sources are particularly valuable because they come from observers who had no stake in either condemning or celebrating Viking practices. They simply recorded what they saw. Modern genetic research has confirmed the scale of captive taking. DNA analysis of Icelandic populations has revealed that a substantial portion of the female ancestral population came from the British Isles. Evidence that captive women taken during the Viking Age became mothers of subsequent generations in Scandinavian societies. Similar patterns appear in genetic studies of other Scandinavian populations. The weight of evidence makes the Viking treatment of captives one of the best documented forced labor systems of the medieval period. What the berserkers and other raiders did to captured women is not legend or stereotype, it is documented fact recorded in sources that have been available to scholars for centuries. Let me return to the specific question of what berserkers did to captives, because their treatment was distinct from that of ordinary raiders. In ways the sources emphasize, the berserkers' role in Viking warfare created psychological conditions that affected how they treated captives. The altered states they entered during combat did not simply end when fighting stopped. The sources describe a transition period during which berserkers remained in heightened states of aggression and reduced inhibition, states in which normal social constraints did not fully apply. The commanders who employed berserkers understood this transition period and made accommodations for it. Berserkers were given access to captives, plunder, and other outlets during the hours or days after combat, partly as reward for their service and partly as practical management of warriors who could not simply be ordered to calm down. What they did during this period was considered their right, not subject to the restrictions that might apply to ordinary warriors. The sources describe berserker treatment of captives in terms that distinguish it from ordinary treatment. The sagas use phrases suggesting that berserkers acted as beasts with captives, that they did not restrain themselves as men would, that their treatment reflected the animal identities they assumed in combat. The Christian sources describe the same behavior in terms of demonic possession, of inhuman cruelty, of practices that exceeded what even other pagans would do. What both types of sources agree on is that berserker treatment was more extreme than ordinary treatment. The breaking that captives experienced at the hands of ordinary raiders was brutal enough. The breaking that captives experienced at the hands of berserkers was something worse, more violent, more sustained, more damaging to body and mind. Sigurd the Red was known for practices that made even other berserkers uncomfortable. The sources do not specify what these practices were. They use the same euphemisms and circumlocutions that appear throughout medieval descriptions of such treatment, but they make clear that Sigurd represented the extreme end of a spectrum that was already extreme, that the women who became his property experienced something beyond what most captives endured. Ælfjefju survived this experience. The two women who had been claimed before her survived it, at least initially. The survival itself is evidence of a kind. The practices were not designed to kill but to break, but survival at what cost, with what damage, leaving what scars. That the sources do not describe these questions indicate the limits of what historical evidence can reveal about individual experience. For Ælfjefju of Northumbria, who was 29 years old when York fell to the great heathen army, who was claimed by berserker named Sigurd the Red as reward for his service in the assault, who endured 11 months of captivity and breaking before being sold at the head market, who disappeared into the Scandinavian THR system and was never seen in England again. For Iber of Mercuria, who was 19 years old when she was captured, who was claimed by a chieftain and kept in conditions of gilded captivity who adapted successfully enough to survive 20 years of slavery, who died at approximately 40 years of age, still far from home, still separated from the family she had last seen on the day of her capture. 4. Quentin of East Anglia, who was 26 years old when she was captured, who chose to fight when others complied, who resisted for 6 weeks before her resistance collapsed, who survived approximately 18 months after her breaking before her body gave up what her mind had already lost, for Hild of Lindisfarne, who was approximately 24 years old when the first great raid fell on her monastery, who was captured specifically because violating her religious vows would be offensive to the Christian God, whose story was preserved not for her sake but for propaganda purposes, whose individual experience remains largely invisible behind the symbolic value her captors and her chroniclers assigned to her. For Godgu of Wessex, who was 33 years old when she was captured, whose medical skills made her valuable in ways that protected her from the worst treatment, who survived 12 years of captivity and was eventually freed, who built a life in the land of her former captives because returning home was no longer possible for the thousands of other women taken from England during 2 centuries of Viking raids, for those sold in Dublin and Herbal in markets whose names are not recorded, for those kept as property on estates throughout Scandinavia, for those who became mothers of children who would never know their stories, for those who died during transport, during breaking, during the long years of captivity, for the ones who resisted and the ones who complied, for the ones who survived and the ones who did not, for the ones whose names were recorded and the ones who were documented only as numbers and trading records, for everyone who experienced what the sources describe without finding words adequate to describe it. They were not adventurers, they were not participants in the Viking Age by choice, they were captured, processed, sold and used according to systems that the Vikings developed over generations of raiding. Their suffering was not incidental to the Viking achievement, it was foundational to it. The wealth that built Scandinavian power came partly from the labor and sale of people like them. They did not choose what happened to them. They were taken from homes and families and lives that they had built, processed through systems designed to destroy their resistance and remake them as property, transporting across seas to lands they had never seen, sold to buyers whose purposes they could not control. Their compliance was survival, adaptation, not acceptance. Their silence in the historical record is not evidence that they accepted their fate. It is evidence that the sources preserve their captors' perspectives rather than their own. They deserved better. They deserved to live free in the lands of their birth. They deserved to raise their children and practice their faith and die among people who knew their names. They deserved to be remembered as people, rather than as property, as individuals, rather than as categories in the THR markets, as women with their own stories, rather than as footnotes in the Viking saga. This is what Viking berserkers did to Saxon noble women after the raids. This is what the breaking process involved: systematic destruction of identity and resistance designed to transform free women into compliant property. This is what the sources document in their own words, in their own records, in evidence that has been available to scholars for centuries. The raids ended centuries ago. The thrall markets closed. The practices documented in the sources have not been used in their original forms for over 1,000 years, but the patterns persist. The methods that Viking raiders developed, capture, breaking sale, forced labor, appear in different forms wherever humans have treated other humans as property. The Viking system was particularly documented, particularly organized, particularly successful for those who operated it. But it was not unique, and somewhere in museum collections around the world, there are artifacts from the Viking Age. Iron collars that bound captive necks, chains that linked human beings into rows for transport, restraints that held bodies still for whatever purposes owners required, physical evidence of a system that processed tens of thousands of people through methods designed to transform them from free people into merchandise. They deserve to be remembered, not as THS, not as property, not as the broken merchandise that the raiders tried to create, as Elf Jefu, as Eid, as Quenth, as Hild, as Godgu, as the women they were before the Northmen came. Subscribe if you want more hidden histories revealed. Comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they know about Vikings but has only seen the romanticized version. The raiders were not noble warriors with a code of honor. The raids were not adventures with glory. For all participants, the sagas tell the victor's story. The captives deserve to have their story told as well. Remember them. Remember what was done to them. Remember